I'm here today with Dr. Darrick Hamilton, the president of the National Economics Association, formerly the Caucus of Black Economists, and a professor at the New School of Economics and Urban Policy. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So you're a proponent of, and really one of the central authors of, a notion called stratification economics. In a nutshell, what is stratification economics?
So stratification economics, well, it is an approach really in reaction to the inability of mainstream or orthodox economics to explain persistent group inequality. And we think that largely that inability is related to their myopic view of how individual agents, if properly incentivized in markets that are unfettered by discrimination, can achieve social mobility.
So there's a whiteboard, and there's me with my preparation and my effort and my ability. And the outcome is a verdict only on my ability in that traditional notion. But when context matters, when inferences people draw about who you are and what you are and so forth, the market's not a whiteboard. The context is not a whiteboard. And you're part of a group in how you're branded rather than just as an individual.
That's exactly right. Stratification economics seeks to understand better how group formation and how individual agents can invest in that group and its role in creating hierarchies that are stratified by domains like gender, domains like race, domains like religious affiliation, and how that process actually creates advantages for individuals. I mean, you probably have heard things like the property rights of whiteness. Well, that is a term that's often absent from the economics profession, but it's somewhat ironic because that term very well has notions of optimization and even rationalization. It would make sense for somebody who gets an economic return from something like their race, their whiteness, to invest in that if they are focused on their individual well-being as well as their relative group positioning.
So some of the context and the structures that we see in society come from politics.
Yes.
And politics, by what you might call belonging to, reinforcing, and supporting a group, might benefit your group at the expense of other groups.
Economics could learn from other disciplines. Economics could benefit from a more political lens to understand how structures are created through politics, for example, from political science, why it might make sense for you to create rules that benefit yourself, your own well-being, and your group. Economics can learn from things like disciplines like sociology to understand the role of identity formation, and why there might be economic returns to investing in your identity and your identity formation, as well as the social hierarchical positioning that identity could create for individuals and groups. You know, we have a focus on civil rights, but you know, to his credit, FDR as well as that movement tried to make things like the right to proper housing, the right to a job, these things as basic human rights that the government would have a role in fulfilling. And if we want to reach a society that's inclusive, I think we very well need to reach that. I mean, the critique of the New Deal would be that it also led to a structuring of inequality, because in the Great Compromise, to get a lot of it passed and to get Southern whites to go on board, they were allowed to maintain their system of Jim Crow. So blacks were excluded from a lot of those rights. You know, things like if you were a domestic worker or if you were an agricultural worker, jobs that were something like 80% overrepresented with black individuals, they were excluded from things like Social Security, things like some of the labor rules, and as well as some of the other benefits. Mm-hmm. Another compromise that also structured in this inequality was allowing local determination of how the funds would be allocated. So if you leave in the hands of a Jim Crow apartheid-like system that was racist in blatant forms, the allocation of these resources, then it will be structured in a way that benefits one population as opposed to the other. Mm-hmm. So that, you know, one thing that we could think about is how this great labor movement that took place and actually led to the creation of a white asset-based middle class, because it went beyond just labor. It went beyond just giving individuals jobs. Mm-hmm. It created real wealth, an asset-based middle class.
Housing in particular.
Yep, exactly right. A debt-free college education, There was even resources put aside so that people could start businesses. All these things led to access to the economic security of an asset that's going to appreciate over your lifetime. What's largely absent from this narrative is how blacks, in particular, were systematically excluded from some of these benefits. We can even talk about gender. In a lot of ways, women were excluded also from these benefits. Perhaps not so much in terms of assets if we think about households as the unit. Now, missing in that narrative is who controls the household assets. But in terms of labor market activities, women were largely excluded from a lot of the jobs that were created from New Deal type policies and things.
So you have a situation where structurally things that may have benefited many Caucasians, they were motivating Caucasians to vote against so as not to be associated with African Americans. And a lot of infrastructure, a lot of what we might call public goods were considered to be stuff for the undeserving, or creating incentives for people to remain lazy rather than what you might call springs for the trampoline for everybody.
Why is it that some whites are willing to go against their interests in the domain of politics? And we talk about Reagan Democrats. We could talk about and pursue policies that might be detrimental to their collective well-being, and they're labeled irrational. I think if we take a stratification lens to this, they might not be so irrational, because stratification economics doesn't only consider overall well-being, it believes that individuals are also concerned about their relative well-being. So there's psychological benefits associated with being better than somebody else, in addition to being overall.
And not being cast out of a group.
And not being cast out.
Because there's safety in that protection of being a member of a social subgroup.
Spot on, right?
Yeah.
So one could characterize this behavior of voting against their perceived interests as investing in the property rights of whiteness, which comes from critical race theory. Again, economics could do better by incorporating this jargon and better understanding it, to think about the rationalization and the optimization associated with investing in something like the property rights of whiteness. But as you point out, violence has historically and in a lot of ways currently been used to codify that property rights and whiteness. Some ways to do it is through voting and structuring the rules that benefit you. But there are not only just psychological benefits associated with it, but there are real economic benefits associated with that as well, such as the risk of being unemployed. If having this system of hierarchy and othering leads you with a greater likelihood of getting a job as opposed to that other group, then it's not irrational to want to invest in it. I think we are ultimately faced with the question that is unanswered and might be context specific as to why would white individuals invest into a system of racism that actually could lead to rules that favor capital at the expense of them? Right? That's an important question. We could think about the labor movement. We could think about how the labor movement over time has been disarmed and
weakened.
Yes. As the relationship that relationship is occurring simultaneously while the labor movement is becoming more black. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that that's a factor. But here's the question: could the white working class benefit from a coalition, including Asians, Latinos, and black people, to their benefit, as opposed to investing in a system that creates these stratifications and ultimately might be to their detriment? Is there some benefit to the white worker of trying to move away from these race rules and this structure of stratification to have a more collective movement of labor so that they can better compete with capital to increase their relative terms of labor bargaining so as to benefit themselves? I think that's weighed against the other factor that has to be considered about whether the white working class would want to invest in the system, which is the economic and psychological benefits associated with the property rights of whiteness that accrue to them. The answer to which is dominant for that white working class group, I think, is unanswered. I think we really don't know that answer. I know what we would like to know. We'd like it to be the case that they would economically absolutely be better off if they were to invest in that system of coalition.
In the realm of stratification economics, there's another dimension which I'd like to explore with you briefly. Inside the black community, there are some people who are excelling. And then there is this kind of blaming the victim kind of energy. And how does a person who aspires to be successful within the black community distinguish themselves without separating from the group? Is that is often discussed as I don't know, a lot of recent discussion about Bill Cosby's controversial speeches and others. But how does the black group in stratification economics stay together to strengthen themselves?
So I'm going to give a slightly long-winded answer that I think is going to get to the point.
Sure.
One of the distinctions between a stratification economics approach and a orthodox or standard economics approach is even looking at the role of discrimination itself. Economics has the presumption that identity is exogenous, that people's bigotry is exogenous. They have a taste for, this is going back to Gary Becker's classic taste for discrimination, and that if you have markets and they're structured well, then if you have somebody that's a bigoted agent, there should be a non-bigoted agent to come along and benefit
Arbitrage
from
away the
profit
that's left on the table.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? So markets should do away with discrimination over time. Stratification economics looks at identity itself as not something that is simply exogenous, but is actually determined by the market and processes where individuals will structure their identity in a certain way that return to investing in your group identity could lead to economic returns or benefits. So that kind of turns the Gary Becker notion of taste for discrimination on its head, that there is a functional role to discrimination, and that functional role is to preserve hierarchy and social hierarchy. So this is going to lead me to answer your question. Black people are not strictly victims of this system or entities without agency in this system.
Right.
That within this system of incentives, where there are economic returns to being associated with a certain group, if we want to generalize even further, we could talk about in-group versus out-group, others versus non-others, right? There are many ways we can talk about males, females, blacks, whites. Well, one point is that thinking of it in those dichotomous terms are overly simplistic.
Yes.
That as a black individual, I have some ability to invest in my blackness, in quotes. I also have some ability to divest in my blackness and choose another identity, and not without constraint. So you could think that some black individuals might have better access to the dominant white in-group than other black individuals. One empirical area that I've been engaged in with my research with colleagues like Art Goldsmith and William Darrick is looking at hierarchy based on skin shade. So in this research we're finding there are economic benefits associated with being light-skinned. There are marital returns for black women if they're lighter skinned. And that seems consistent with our system that preferences certain descriptive characteristics that are associated with the in-group, right? So going back to your point, we have incentives in our society for individuals that are in the out-group to try to move away from that out-group so that they can get economic returns. Some individuals are better positioned to divest in their identity or to invest in the other identity than others, but nonetheless, those incentives are strong. Now, of course, those incentives are not without constraint, and this is why stratification economics tries to admonish, or not admonish, what's a better word, try to infuse upon economics or try to better develop economics with other disciplines. Yeah.
Let's turn to a slightly different realm, the realms of economic policy. There are, how would I say, in post-2008 period, we're in a world of what people refer to as austerity. You and I have talked about how we justify austerity on the grounds of not creating too much free stuff for the undeserving. There's another side to the coin, which is when you have prolonged austerity, people become more anxious about their futures. They become perhaps inspired to form subgroups, try to identify others who can be pushed out to harbor those resources for themselves. And there is increasing evidence, I've been working a little bit on it myself and with Arjun Jayadav, that when there's prolonged austerity, symptoms of racial discord rise, that there's actually a negative side effect from austere macroeconomic policies. But now it's a two-way street. If austerity creates more racial side effects that are what I'll call a social toxin, and people are justifying that austerity on the grounds that people are undeserving, you have a terrible spiral in place. There's a rationale for persisting in things that make us worse off.
This fits well with the notion of a functional role of discrimination. If there is a functional role to discrimination, when there's greater scarcity created by austerity policy, then you expect even more intense discrimination. You expect groups to become more competitive, and you expect more viciousness within the competition of positioning, so that you can benefit your group. So we talked about this earlier as well. The Federal Reserve, as well as the U.S. government, should consider this when pursuing austerity policy, its social ramification with regards to heightened things like greater racial discrimination and tension and some of the events that we might see occurring. Right? It doesn't just happen, it happens in part as a result of scarcity.
Yes.
When there's plentifulness, there's less competition.
Yes, yes.
And then, feeding more about the question about policy, we talked earlier about the role of economic rights, that there's a role for government to instill economic rights so that people can have access to the economic dignity of a job, so that people can have access to the economic security of an asset that's going to appreciate over time. I think that's very important. I think another thing that should be heightened and paid attention to is the role of resource itself as a social determinant. We often think of wealth as an outcome to some process or some product of things like investing in education, hard work, things like that. But resource itself, often measured in terms of assets like wealth, becomes social determinants. The more wealthy I am, the better health I will have. The more wealthy I am, the better access I have to a job. The more wealthy I am, the better likelihood I could have a greater horizon to plan, to have the freedom to make choices, to say, leave my job and support myself so that I can pursue another endeavor.
Yes.
So not only is wealth...
and your children.
And my
it
children.
extends across generations. The better education experience and so forth they will have, the better health they'll have. So it propagates over time.
Absolutely. That's another great, excellent point, the iterative nature of wealth,
Yes.
that it builds over time. And, how is wealth built? Well, it's not built because people get high levels of education. It's not built because people get high levels of income. They all matter. I don't want to say those things don't matter, but they often matter within context. So we know that black individuals that have greater levels of education, that are graduates from college, a black family that has a college degree has a lower net worth position than a white family where the head dropped out of high school.
Yeah.
We know that black families that are full-time employed have a lower wealth position than white families where the head is unemployed. So these notions of studying hard and hard work, they're not going to solve the interracial disparities in things like wealth, which is a key social determinant, but they matter within group. We know that black individuals with higher levels of education have more wealth than black individuals with less. So I think it's, again, important to keep in mind the co-determinant relationship between things like education, hard work, and wealth, and vice versa. And it's likely the case that vice versa is even stronger. That we have a paper, I think, that's aptly titled, "Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain, Why Studying Hard and Working Hard is Not Enough for Black Americans." Clearly, we go outside and see people with umbrellas. That doesn't mean that the umbrellas cause the rain. So clearly, we go and see people with high levels of wealth and education. Doesn't necessarily mean that education caused the high levels of wealth. We know that wealth was generated iteratively, that they might have got a key transfer from a family member or access to a government program at a key point in their life that put them into an asset like a home like a debt-free college education, that provided them the economic security from that asset over their life course.
I appreciate your coming in here today and exploring with us, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.